The figure of Moses looms large in religious history. Revered as a prophet, lawgiver, and leader in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, he is credited with leading the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage, receiving divine law at Mount Sinai, and guiding a wandering nation toward its destiny. Yet for all the monumental roles attributed to Moses, a perplexing question lingers. Did he exist as a historical figure? This question isn't just academic. It cuts to the heart of faith, tradition, and historical inquiry. If Moses never existed, what does that mean for the foundational narratives of three major world religions? If he did exist, what kind of man was he? As with many ancient figures, the stories of Moses are told through the lens of faith. They are richly detailed in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. However, these texts are not historical records in the modern sense. They are theological documents written with a purpose to convey religious truths, unify a community, and legitimize a nation's origins. The Bible describes Moses as the liberator of the Israelites, chosen by God to confront Pharaoh, deliver divine plagues, part the Red Sea, and lead a nation through the wilderness. It portrays him as a man uniquely favored by God, receiving the 10 Commandments and speaking to the divine as one might speak to a friend. But when we step outside the pages of Scripture, the picture becomes murky. There is no mention of Moses in Egyptian records, no archaeological evidence of an Israelite exodus, and no corroborating accounts of a massive migration through the Sinai desert. This silence from the historical and archaeological record has led some scholars to propose that Moses may be a legendary figure, a literary construct designed to give the Israelites a shared history and identity. Yet legends often have roots in reality. Could Moses have been a historical leader whose story was later embellished with miracles and divine encounters? Or was he entirely a product of myth-making, a symbol rather than a man? To explore these possibilities, we must first understand how Moses is depicted in the Bible, then compare those depictions with historical evidence and the broader cultural context of the ancient Near East. The heart of Moses' story lies in his confrontation with Pharaoh, demanding, "Let my people go." When Pharaoh refuses, God unleashes 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt, culminating in the death of the firstborn sons. This final plague convinces Pharaoh to release the Israelites, only for him to pursue them as they flee. The parting of the Red Sea is the climax of this narrative. Moses, with God's help, divides the waters to allow the Israelites to escape, while Pharaoh's army is drowned. This event is foundational to Jewish identity, symbolizing God's power and faithfulness in delivering his people. However, from a historical perspective, this part of the story raises significant questions. There is no archaeological or textual evidence outside the Bible to support the occurrence of the plagues or the mass migration of Israelites through the desert. The absence of such evidence, given the scale of these events, has led many scholars to question their historicity. After the Exodus, Moses leads the Israelites to Mount Sinai, where he receives the 10 Commandments and establishes the covenant between God and his people. This moment is pivotal, as it defines the relationship between the Israelites and their deity, laying the foundation for Jewish law and ethics. The narrative portrays Moses as a mediator who ascends the mountain to speak directly with God. Yet it also reveals the frailty of the Israelites, who build a golden calf in Moses' absence, prompting his anger and God's judgment. This story is rich with theological meaning, but poses historical challenges. The detailed laws and covenantal framework described at Sinai reflect a level of societal organization that doesn't align with the nomadic context depicted in the Exodus. Some scholars suggest that these laws were developed later during the period of the Israelite monarchy and retroactively attributed to Moses to lend them divine authority. The Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the desert serve as a period of testing and transformation. Moses acts as both leader and intercessor, navigating the challenges of rebellion, scarcity, and divine punishment. The story is filled with miraculous events, such as manna from heaven and water from a rock, reinforcing God's provision and Moses' role as his chosen leader. Yet the lack of archaeological evidence for a prolonged nomadic existence in the Sinai Peninsula casts doubt on this part of the narrative. While some suggest that the wandering reflects historical migrations or smaller-scale events, others view it as a symbolic story of spiritual growth and covenant renewal. Moses' journey ends on Mount Nebo, where he views the promised land but is denied entry due to a previous act of disobedience. His death is described with reverence and his burial place remains unknown, adding a sense of mystery and finality to his story. This ending serves a dual purpose. It reinforces the idea that even great leaders are subject to divine justice, and it transitions leadership to Joshua, setting the stage for the conquest of Canaan. The absence of a burial site also prevents Moses from becoming the center of a cult of veneration, keeping the focus on God rather than the prophet. The biblical narrative of Moses is deeply theological, presenting him as a divinely appointed leader whose life reflects God's power, justice, and mercy. However, it is also a story filled with literary motifs and symbolic elements that raise questions about its historical accuracy. Understanding Moses as a character in Scripture is the first step in exploring whether he existed as a historical figure, or whether his story serves a different purpose in the development of Israelite identity. The story of Moses is monumental, depicting a leader chosen by God to free the Israelites from Egyptian oppression and guide them to the Promised Land. The Exodus, the central event associated with Moses, is described in the Bible as a large-scale migration of the Israelite people out of Egypt, marked by divine interventions such as plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, and 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. However, these events leave no trace in the historical or archaeological record. Ancient Egypt was meticulous in recording events, from royal decrees to construction projects and military campaigns. Yet there is no mention of the plagues, the sudden departure of a large slave population, or the drowning of Pharaoh's army in any known Egyptian texts. Such an event would have been significant enough to warrant documentation, even if framed from an Egyptian perspective. Archaeological surveys of the Sinai Peninsula have failed to uncover evidence of a large, sustained population living there for 40 years, as described in the biblical account. While some argue that nomadic groups may not leave significant archaeological footprints, the scale and duration of the Exodus narrative suggest there should be at least some evidence, such as campsites or tools. Some scholars propose that the Exodus story may be a collective memory of smaller migrations or local events, later mythologized and expanded into a unified narrative. Others suggest it reflects the experiences of a distinct subgroup within the larger Canaanite population who sought to establish a unique identity. While the Exodus lacks direct corroboration, certain elements of the Moses story resonate with known aspects of Egyptian culture and history, hinting at possible inspirations or parallels. Historical records confirm that Egypt used slave labor, including Semitic peoples, for construction projects during the New Kingdom period. However, there is no evidence of an Israelite-specific slave population or a mass escape of such laborers. The name Moses, Moshe in Hebrew, is linguistically similar to Egyptian names, such as Thutmose or Amose, which mean born of or child of. This suggests a possible Egyptian origin for the name, though its connection to the biblical figure remains speculative. The 10 plagues described in the Bible could reflect exaggerated accounts of natural disasters or ecological events in Egypt, such as the annual flooding of the Nile, outbreaks of disease, or locust swarms. While such events may have inspired elements of the narrative, they do not provide direct evidence of Moses or the Exodus. Moses is depicted as the mediator of the divine covenant, receiving the 10 Commandments and delivering laws to the Israelites. This role parallels other ancient figures who are credited with establishing legal codes. The Code of Hammurabi predates the Mosaic Law and reflects a comprehensive legal framework given by a king under divine authority. Similarities between the two suggest shared cultural influences in the ancient Near East. Sargon's legend includes a birth story remarkably similar to that of Moses, involving his rescue as an infant and rise to greatness. These parallels highlight recurring motifs in ancient storytelling where leaders are divinely chosen and uniquely preserved. While the lack of evidence for Moses and the Exodus is troubling for those seeking historical confirmation, archaeology does shed light on the emergence of Israel as a distinct cultural group. Archaeological findings suggest that the Israelites originated from within Canaan rather than migrating from Egypt. The transition from Canaanite city-states to Israelite settlements involved shifts in material culture such as simpler pottery and the absence of pig bones in dietary remains, which may reflect evolving religious practices. A 13th century BCE Egyptian inscription, the Meneptah stele, contains the earliest known reference to Israel, describing it as a people group within Canaan. While this confirms the existence of Israel as a distinct entity during this period, it provides no connection to Moses or the Exodus narrative. The absence of direct evidence for Moses and the events described in the Bible does not necessarily mean he didn't exist. It does, however, suggest that the story as told may be more theological than historical. Moses could represent a collective memory of various leaders, events, and migrations woven into a single narrative for theological and cultural purposes. But as we dig deeper, a fascinating question arises. If Moses' life as described in the Bible lacks concrete historical support, how does his narrative compare to other legendary figures of the ancient world? What patterns emerge when we place him within the broader tapestry of myth, legend, and historical storytelling? One striking aspect of Moses' tale is his miraculous infancy. Pharaoh's decree to kill all newborn Hebrew boys and Moses' subsequent rescue from a basket floating down the Nile are iconic moments in biblical storytelling. Yet this motif of the vulnerable infant who survives to become a great leader is not unique. Sargon of Akkad, a Mesopotamian king from the 3rd millennium BCE, was also said to have been placed in a basket, set adrift on a river, and rescued to fulfill a grand destiny. This parallel suggests a shared narrative structure across cultures where miraculous beginnings signal divine favor and the promise of greatness. These commonalities extend beyond infancy. Moses' role as a lawgiver mirrors figures like Hammurabi of Babylon, whose famous code of laws was presented as divinely ordained. Hammurabi, like Moses, was depicted as receiving these laws from a god, emphasizing the divine legitimacy of his rule and legal system. Such parallels point to a recurring theme in ancient literature. Leaders and lawgivers are often elevated through divine association, granting their authority a sacred aura. Moses' narrative also features epic confrontations with oppressive powers, akin to those found in other ancient traditions. His battle against Pharaoh, culminating in the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, resonates with stories of heroes overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds with divine assistance. In Greek mythology, for example, figures like Perseus and Heracles often faced challenges that required intervention from the gods. These stories, much like the tale of Moses, serve to highlight the hero's chosen status and reinforce the power of the divine. Beyond these legendary motifs, Moses' role as a mediator between God and humanity positions him as a figure of immense theological significance. The biblical narrative describes him ascending Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, an act that establishes the covenant between God and the Israelites. This moment is not only foundational for Judaism, but also echoes themes found in other traditions, where mountains often symbolize divine encounters. Ancient Near Eastern cultures frequently associated mountains with the dwelling places of gods, emphasizing their sacred nature as sites of revelation and authority. However, it's not just the similarities to other myths that intrigue scholars, it's the ways in which Moses' story diverges. Unlike the grand victories and triumphant ends often granted to legendary heroes, Moses' tale ends on a somber note. After decades of leading the Israelites through the wilderness, Moses is denied entry into the Promised Land. He dies on Mount Nebo, gazing at the land he will never enter. This conclusion underscores a key element of the biblical narrative. Even great leaders are subject to divine judgment. Moses' story is as much about human frailty and the challenges of leadership as it is about divine power. This nuanced portrayal has led some scholars to propose that Moses' story may be less about a single individual and more about a collective experience. It could reflect the struggles and aspirations of a group seeking to define itself in a volatile and competitive environment. The figure of Moses, with his blend of triumphs and vulnerabilities, serves as an ideal focal point for this identity-building process. This perspective aligns with what we know about the historical emergence of Israel. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Israelites arose as a distinct group within Canaan, likely composed of diverse peoples who came together over time. The story of Moses and the Exodus, then, might not recount literal events, but rather embody a shared memory or myth that unified these early communities. In this sense, Moses becomes a symbol, a representation of liberation, law, and covenant that transcends historical particulars. Still, the narrative's enduring appeal lies in its ability to bridge the gap between history and theology. For believers, Moses' story is a testament to God's power and faithfulness, a narrative that inspires trust and obedience. For skeptics, it's a masterful work of storytelling rich with themes and archetypes that speak to the human experience. In comparing Moses to other legendary figures, one thing becomes clear. His story is part of a broader tradition of myth-making that ancient cultures used to explain their origins, values, and beliefs. Yet Moses' narrative carries a distinct weight, one that continues to shape religious thought and identity to this day. The origins of Moses are as enigmatic as they are intriguing. If Moses did exist, was he a singular historical leader, or could his story be an amalgamation of various traditions, leaders, and events woven into a cohesive narrative? Scholars have long debated whether Moses is a historical figure or a composite character representing the collective memory of the ancient Israelites. One theory suggests that Moses was a historical leader whose story was later embellished with miracles and divine encounters to serve theological and political purposes. In this view, Moses could have been a tribal leader or a revolutionary figure who played a role in uniting disparate groups within ancient Canaan. His story then might reflect real events, such as smaller migrations or conflicts with Egypt, but these were later magnified to create a grand narrative of liberation and divine covenant. Supporting this perspective is the possibility that Moses represents a cultural bridge between Egypt and Israel. The biblical account places Moses at the heart of Egyptian society, raised as a prince in Pharaoh's court, yet aligned with the oppressed Israelites. His name, with its Egyptian etymology, suggests a connection to that cultural context. This dual identity makes Moses an ideal figure to symbolize the transition from bondage to freedom, from Egyptian servitude to a distinct Israelite identity. Another theory proposes that Moses is not a single historical figure, but a composite of multiple leaders and events. In this scenario, the stories of various tribal leaders, prophets, and reformers were amalgamated over time, resulting in the singular figure of Moses. This approach explains the diverse and sometimes contradictory aspects of his character. For example, Moses is both a lawgiver and a warrior, a prophet and a diplomat, roles that might reflect the contributions of different individuals or traditions. This theory also accounts for the symbolic richness of Moses' narrative. His miraculous birth, divine calling, and role as a mediator between God and his people align with archetypal themes found in myths and legends worldwide. These elements suggest that Moses' story was crafted not only to record historical events, but also to convey profound theological and cultural truths. A third perspective views Moses as a purely symbolic creation, a literary figure designed to unify and inspire the emerging Israelite community. This interpretation sees the story of Moses and the Exodus as a foundational myth rather than a historical account. Like the epic heroes of other ancient cultures, Moses serves as a vehicle for expressing collective identity, values, and aspirations. For example, the Exodus narrative embodies themes of liberation and divine justice, which would have been deeply meaningful to a people seeking to establish themselves in a competitive and often hostile environment. The laws attributed to Moses at Mount Sinai provide a framework for governance and social cohesion, reinforcing the idea of a covenantal relationship with a single all-powerful deity. This symbolic interpretation is supported by the absence of archaeological evidence for the Exodus or the Sinai wilderness journey. It also aligns with the broader trend of ancient societies using origin stories to legitimize their authority and define their place in the world. In this view, Moses is less a historical figure and more a projection of the Israelite community's ideals and experiences. Yet even if Moses is a symbolic creation, his story may still reflect historical realities. The narrative of bondage in Egypt, for instance, could echo collective memories of oppression or servitude experienced by Semitic peoples in the ancient Near East. Similarly, the laws attributed to Moses might represent the codification of oral traditions and legal practices that evolved over centuries. Ultimately, the question of Moses' origins is less about uncovering definitive answers and more about understanding the interplay between history, myth, and faith. The story of Moses, as recorded in the Bible, is one of the most profound and influential narratives in religious history. But how was this story written, and what does its composition reveal about its origins? To answer these questions, scholars often turn to the documentary hypothesis, a theory that suggests the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, was not authored by a single individual but rather compiled from multiple sources over centuries. At the heart of this hypothesis lies the idea that the story of Moses was shaped by various traditions, each reflecting distinct theological and cultural perspectives. These sources, traditionally identified as J. Yahwist, E. Elohist, P. Priestly, and D. Deuteronomic, contribute different layers to the narrative, resulting in a text that is both rich in meaning and complex in composition. The Yahwist and Elohist sources are the earliest layers of the Pentateuch, dating to the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, respectively. They provide much of the narrative framework for the story of Moses, including his birth, the Exodus, and the covenant at Sinai. The Yahwist source is known for its vivid storytelling and anthropomorphic depiction of God, who interacts directly with Moses and the Israelites. This source often emphasizes the promise of the land and God's close relationship with his chosen people. For instance, the Yahwist describes Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush in deeply personal terms, portraying a deity who is intimately involved in human affairs. In contrast, the Elohist source reflects a more transcendent view of God, often mediated through angels or dreams. This source places a strong emphasis on prophecy and moral obedience. In the Moses narrative, the Elohist's influence can be seen in the focus on Moses as a prophet and mediator, as well as in the moral dimensions of the covenant at Sinai. The priestly source, thought to have been composed during or after the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE, contributes a distinct layer to the Moses story. It focuses on ritual law and the formal relationship between God and the Israelites. The priestly source often portrays Moses as a lawgiver and ritual leader, emphasizing the establishment of the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the sacrificial system. This source's contribution is particularly evident in the detailed legal and ritual instructions given at Sinai. For example, the construction of the tabernacle and the ordination of Aaron and his sons as priests are central themes in the priestly narrative. These elements reflect the concerns of a post-exilic community seeking to rebuild its identity through worship and adherence to divine law. The Deuteronomic source, associated with the reforms of King Josiah in the 7th century BCE, provides the theological and ethical framework for much of the Moses narrative. It is responsible for the book of Deuteronomy, which presents Moses' farewell address to the Israelites before they enter the Promised Land. In this source, Moses is portrayed as a teacher and covenant enforcer, urging the Israelites to remain faithful to God's commandments. The Deuteronomic narrative emphasizes themes of obedience, blessing, and curse, reflecting the historical context of a kingdom grappling with the challenges of maintaining its religious identity. The composite nature of the Pentateuch is further supported by the presence of anachronisms and contradictions within the text. For example, the Bible describes Moses receiving the law on Mount Sinai, yet some of the laws reflect practices and concerns more relevant to a settled agricultural society than to a nomadic group wandering in the wilderness. Additionally, the narrative contains overlapping and sometimes conflicting accounts of key events. For instance, the story of water from a rock appears in both Exodus 17, Yahwist, and Numbers 20, Priestly, with significant differences in detail and tone. The laws given at Sinai in Exodus differ from those presented in Deuteronomy, reflecting the theological priorities of different sources. These inconsistencies suggest that the story of Moses was not written as a cohesive narrative by a single author, but was instead compiled from multiple traditions, each contributing its perspective to the larger story. The use of multiple sources reflects the historical and cultural context of ancient Israel. As the Israelites transitioned from a loose confederation of tribes to a centralized kingdom and later to an exiled and dispersed community, their stories and laws evolved to address new challenges and realities. The figure of Moses, as the ultimate prophet, lawgiver, and leader, became a unifying symbol for these diverse traditions. By weaving these sources together, the final editors of the Pentateuch created a narrative that not only preserved the distinct voices of Israel's history, but also offered a theological vision that could resonate across generations. Scholars and skeptics have raised compelling counter-arguments that challenge the existence of Moses as a historical figure and question the veracity of the events described in the Bible. One of the most striking issues is the absence of independent evidence for Moses or the events of the Exodus outside the Bible. Ancient Egypt, known for its meticulous record-keeping, offers no mention of plagues, a large population of Hebrew slaves, or a dramatic mass departure. Such events would likely have had significant social, economic, and political repercussions, yet Egyptian records remain silent. This silence undermines the credibility of the biblical narrative. If the Exodus involved hundreds of thousands of people, as the Bible suggests, it would have been one of the largest migrations in ancient history, leaving an undeniable imprint on the historical record. The absence of such evidence suggests that the story may have been retroactively constructed to serve a theological or cultural purpose. The Exodus narrative describes the Israelites as a massive group, numbering 600,000 men, not including women and children. This figure implies a total population of over 2 million people, an enormous number for the time. Yet archaeological surveys of the Sinai Peninsula, where the Israelites are said to have wandered for 40 years, have found no evidence of a population of this size. No remnants of campsites, tools, or other artifacts have been discovered. This lack of evidence indicates that the Exodus story, as described in the Bible, is unlikely to be historical. The story may instead reflect a smaller, localized migration or a symbolic narrative rather than an actual mass movement. The story of Moses contains numerous internal contradictions and inconsistencies that raise questions about its historical reliability.
If you enjoy our content, we'd love your support. By joining one of our channel memberships, you help us continue creating videos like this one while gaining access to some amazing perks. As a member, you'll unlock exclusive content available only to supporters, earn loyalty badges to show off in comments and live chats, and enjoy priority responses to your comments, shoutouts, and more. The best part? Memberships start at just $2.99 a month, less than a cup of coffee. Even small contributions make a big difference for the PJ Bible TV team in covering production costs and delivering the content you love. And if you're not ready to become a channel member today but still want to support us, there are other ways to help. Engaging with our videos is a tremendous way to show your support. By taking just a few moments to like the video, share it with friends, family, or on social media, and leave a comment, you're telling the YouTube algorithm to share our content with more people. Your support, no matter how you choose to show it, means the world to us. Thank you for being part of the PJ Bible TV community.